So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, Learning from Loved Housing. So this is part of our Retrofit Talks series at the Building Centre, and it's actually our penultimate webinar for the Retrofit 23 programme, which is all about exploring residential retrofit and how to achieve deep retrofit of homes at scale. So thank you all for joining, and I'm delighted that we have Ben Derbyshire presenting for us today on the topic of learning from loved housing. Just a little bit about Ben, for those of you who don't know. So Ben is chair of HTA Design, a multidisciplinary design practice specialising in housing and placemaking, where his role also includes directing the practice's internal design review processes. Ben is a Commissioner of Historic England, and he serves on the London Advisory Committee, High Streets Action Zone Board, and is chair of the Historic Places Panel. Ben sits on the governing court of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects, and he was president of the RIBA from 2017 to 2019. So we're delighted that Ben could take the time today to come and present to us within this Retrofit Talks series. We're going to hear Ben's presentation in a minute. This will last for about 20-25 minutes. So thank you once again for attending. I really hope you enjoy the session. And over to Ben for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to share my screen and then click. You all got that?
Yep, that's perfect,
good.
Ben.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you very much indeed for the introduction, and it's a delight to be here. I'm going to talk about the practice which I'm privileged to chair. I'm going to talk about the practice today. I'm going to talk about the history of the practice as well, if I may, particularly in regard to renovation projects, which were the lifeblood of the practice, especially in the early years. I'm going to talk about what we knew and understood back then as community architecture. And then I'm going to talk about just a few renovation projects in a bit more detail. First of all, Winterton House in Tower Hamlets, which was completed nearly a quarter of a century ago, which I thought would be worthwhile revisiting. I'm going to talk about a contemporary one, the Sutton Estate in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. I'm also going to talk about my book and the theme of this talk, Learning from Loved Housing, which comes from that book. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our own studio, which you see in the image in front of you to close the presentation. Now, here we go. It's not, oh, here we are, it is moving on. So this is us outside our new studio in Hackney Wick. It says there are 250 plus people in the organization. Actually, to be clear, there were slightly less than 250 people just at the minute, although we are recruiting for some key posts, so keep your eyes open for that. We were founded originally in 1969, but the practice in its current format was actually relaunched in 2013 following a management buyout, which I led with 5 younger partners. We have 4 studios, including this one in Hackney Wick, but also in Edinburgh, Bristol and Manchester. And we are interdisciplinary. We're not just architects, so we do landscape design, we have a planning team, we have a graphics and communications team, we have a team of environmental engineers who work with us on our sustainability objectives. We do computer aided modeling, we do CGIs, our own CGIs, and so on. So we're a thoroughly interdisciplinary team these days. We describe ourselves as housing people, and when we reformed the practice in 2013, we revisited our purpose. And there are 2 aspects of this. The first is making great places, and this is a slide which basically tries to cover the breadth of the kinds of things that we do. These days, ironically, very much more new buildings than renovations. But some of you will be familiar with some of these. At the top left, you have 10 degrees in Croydon, which I won't be talking about in any detail today, but for the record, it's the tallest modular prefabricated building in the world, although right next to it, as you can see in the second row, second in from the left, is a building which is slightly taller, being made by the same fabricator and the same contractor, and actually the same developer, but also designed by us. These buildings are about half the energy consumption of the traditional equivalent, by which I mean buildings with reinforced concrete frames and infill panels in the traditional high-rise methodology. They have about half the embodied carbon, and they're built twice as quickly because they're made in the factory and the process is a great deal more efficient. We're not going to go into that in too much detail, but you can see a range of the other kinds of projects that we do, which include quite a lot of suburban work. We have a whole team that work on as sustainable as we can make them projects for housing developers. We're chosen, generally speaking, only when there is a requirement to deliver higher standards than those to which speculative house builders are required to meet. But anyway, that's a range of the kinds of places that we are involved in our purpose of making great places. But our other purpose is making a great place to work. And actually, our new studio plays a part in that. But it's been a tradition of the practice that ever since we were first formed, we always have lunch together. Now we have breakfasts in the studios. We have evening events. We have a great wide range of extramural activities that we participate in. You can see here one of our cycling teams, but we have other sports teams. There are images here of our winter exhibition event where we display for our own benefit, actually, in all 4 studios, all the projects that we've completed or all of the commissions that we've completed in any given year. And that's actually quite a lot. I mean, it's between 100 and 150 individual commissions every year. So we like to keep everybody abreast of what it is that we are doing. So making great places and making a great place to work is what we exist for. But I want to go back a bit, since we're talking about renovation, and reflecting on the fact that for many, many years, the bread and butter of the practice was renovation. Originally, we were called Hunt Thompson Associates, and that's us on our 10th anniversary in 1979 outside our shopfront studio in Parkway, Camden Town. And that's me, second from the left, in my Oshkosh dungarees, slightly embarrassingly, but with Bernard Hunt and John Thompson, the H and T in HTA in the middle there. And here is a range of the kinds of projects that we did. Sandringham Buildings is the next on the left. That's in Charing Cross Road. Henry Pord's books, if anybody you're into secondhand books, that lovely range of fascinating shops were preserved by the Soho Housing Trust, who were our client for that building. Winterton House, I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment. Thames Tunnel Mills is the only social housing project with a frontage on the Thames, which we renovated for London and Quadrant Housing Trust. Nightingale Heights at the bottom left is one of many high-rise renovations that we have done in the past. All these were done in the old days with traditional procurement. I'm saying that because in renovation generally, and certainly in the light of Grenfell Tower, I would suggest that design and build is not a suitable methodology for procuring high-rise refurbishments. Our experience of that, by the way, because I'm not going to talk about this in much more detail later on, is that the residents of these buildings are often highly satisfied with their circumstances, so that the whole mythology about high-rise hell is overblown in our experience. And that's usually because families, by the time we get to renovate these buildings, are no longer housed in them. They're suitable for young people and without children and the elder population. Then Leaveview House and Newquay House were two mansion block renovations, which I'm going to be talking about in a bit more detail in a moment. And all these images are from our 50th anniversary celebration in 2019, where every week for the whole year we published an image and a short dialogue on social media about the preceding 50 years. But then community architecture. So in those days, and I'm talking about the 1980s, we were accused of abrogating our responsibility as designers and architects, believe it or not. We were heavily criticized, and quite a substantial proportion of the established architectural profession regarded us as threatening. So it was an interesting time and challenging. But back in those days, the RIBA did have the courage to set up a community architecture resource centre, which was on the ground floor in the space where the gallery now is. And we had a community architecture group of which I was a member, and we actually gave out grants to community architects and community groups, which were funded by the Department of the Environment, as was DLUC now. I mean, difficult to imagine that the department would these days channel funds through the RIBA for the benefit of community groups and community architects, but that's what it did back then. At the top left was our pioneering project at Leaveview House, and that was the spur for us to establish our own social research subsidiary. It was called User Research, stands for Urban, Social and Environmental Research, and it used social research techniques actually from product manufacturing. And we used that to create a relationship with large populations of the communities living in the buildings, which are illustrated here, and to elicit the nature of the needs, the problems, and their aspirations, so that we could begin on a secure footing to engage with them in a long process of co-design. Leaveview House at the bottom left, it's early 1980s, visit it, it's in Hackney. It's worn extremely well. It overlooks the Lee Valley Park. And the radical refurbishment we did, radical for those days, was to provide two-story accommodation at the ground level and lift access to smaller apartments above. And those rather cheery postmodern lift towers were our contribution to the modelling of the estate, and their polychromatic brickwork was definitely a preference expressed by the residents. I've included, second on the left and bottom right, pictures showing the future king, because although he, in his 1980s speech at the 100th anniversary of the RIBA, took a pretty good swipe at us. In fact, in many ways, the then Prince of Wales was a great supporter of these principles and of others, particularly to do with biodiversity. So when it comes to community engagement and sustainable development, I continue to endorse his contribution in those days, and right up until he was crowned king. So a serious supporter and influencer of the movement. Now, I'm going to talk about two of the specific projects in a little bit more detail. And this one is Winterton House in Tower Hamlets on the Commercial Road, which, as you can see in the image on the left, was actually one of 4 buildings created using a very light gauge hot rolled steel frame, which was wrapped around a concrete core, as you can see. It was clad in glass fiber panels, which were made by an ambulance manufacturer, and its steel frame was fireproofed using sprayed asbestos. It swayed. It swayed so much in the wind that the tenant I got to know on the top floor when we did this refurbishment told us that she had standing waves in her fish tank. So a seriously alarming proposition to live in a building like that. But rather more to the point, as it swayed, the sprayed asbestos insulation and fireproofing on the steel frame flaked off like dandruff and circulated around the building, so that it had the highest free particulate count of asbestos in any domestic environment in Europe, we were told when we came to it. We did this work before Ken Livingstone, the first mayor of London, lifted the lid on densities in London. So effectively what we were doing was, as I always used to say, we were refurbishing a planning approval, because we would have never have got to do a high-rise block in those days at these densities. The overall density of the existing estate was 150 dwellings per hectare, but if you took this site on its own, it was well above that. What we did, I'm slightly watching the time here, I've got to move on, is we worked with this blended practice no longer, long subsumed into larger organizations of Whitby Bird, and in particular the inspiring engineer Bryn Bird, who, by the way, in his spare time was busy in his apartment in Wapping trying to build an ornithopter. A different story, and I don't think he ever succeeded in achieving man-powered flight, but he did provide us with a structural solution to this difficult building. The exposed frame, by the way, that you see on the previous slide, was featured by Rachel Whiteread, the sculptor, who has illustrated it in one of her books. She's a great, the theme of her work is inside outness, I suppose. So I think she rather liked the fact that the inside of the building was exposed to the elements for the duration of our renovation project. But what we did was we wrapped it in solid brickwork. It was, as you can see from that picture on the top left, 4 bricks thick at the bottom and 1 brick thick at the top. 4 L-shaped elements in plan, completely unreinforced, so load-bearing on its own account, and tied together at the top by the spidery frame that you see in the bottom right image. The purpose of that was to compress the brickwork elements and stretch post-tension the existing steel structure, so that it had the bearing capacity necessary to accommodate the increased weight of new concrete floors, which we had to insert to higher standards of sound insulation than was possible previously. And behind the behind the brickwork is a thick layer of non-combustible blown glass insulation. We do post-occupancy evaluation on our projects these days, and at the top right you see the fellow who said, Melvin Smith, who offered us that quote on the bottom left. This is a much more recent one. This will be completed in 2025. This is the Sutton Estate in Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea for Clarion Housing Group, but it was built by the William Sutton Trust, which was one of the original banker-funded housing trusts that provided low-cost housing for working people, I think, as they saw it in those days. It's 1.5 bricks thick at the base and 1 brick thick at the top. And it has, in common with all of these kinds of projects, very low space standards internally. I think what's interesting about these kinds of projects is that it's in a conservation area. Its heritage significance is not just that it's of popular aesthetic value and much loved by the people who live in it and around it, but it has very powerful community meaning, a civic purpose for those people who live in and around it. You can see the site plan of the buildings that were demolished in order to make way for it in the mid-19th century. Our renovation of it is achieved by obviously adding insulation to the inside of the external walls. That is a breathable system of wood fiber coated with lime plaster in order to make sure that we avoid mold growth. And that's all the more important because, of course, we have new windows, which I'll come to in a mo, and we have an MVHR system so that it's effectively hermetically sealed, heated by ground source heat pumps. I'm going to have to rattle on because I've got till 1:30 and I've only got 4 minutes left. These are images of the external spaces, and on this theme of it being a popular and successful building that would unquestionably not meet contemporary standards. One of the challenges we had, of course, was that we were not able to meet the external amenity standards or the private amenity standards or the standards of play required by the GLA. But let it be known that this building was, this project has been carried out with close community engagement, and in no sense is anybody who lives in it less than entirely satisfied with what is happening there. I think there's an important lesson for us all there about learning from the past, which is what my book is about, Home Truths. And I wrote it because towards the end of my presidency, somebody rang me up and said, would you write a book about housing? And I thought, well, what shall I write about? And I thought I'd write a primer for young architects, or actually anybody with an interest in planning or designing housing. And so it has 10 chapters which go from lessons from utopia, actually the influences that give us the contemporary zeitgeist for all that we're doing, through a range of issues such as social context of practice, planning, the importance of streets, community architecture and engagement, and so on. But one particular chapter is called Learning from Loved Housing, and that's what's given me the theme for today's talk. And this is the frontispiece of that chapter, which is based on a splendid book which I commend to you by Stuart Brand, which is called Buildings That Learn, What Happens After Buildings Are Finished. And it's a really important analysis of those things which we need to understand if we're going to get the best out of the existing built fabric, as we now must in the struggle to overcome the climate crisis. And these buildings in particular are the kinds of buildings which I think, well, we learnt from in our practice, and I think are good examples of buildings that learn. The terraced housing on the bottom left that I cut my teeth on as a young architect, mansion blocks, and I've shown you examples of the kinds of buildings that we are now renovating and have in the past, which have much lower standards, particularly of front to backs and distance between buildings. That, of course, that illustration is South Kensington by Richard Norman Shaw, which has one of the highest plot ratios anywhere. And at the bottom right, Suburbia, where some of you may know we've been working on a project called Superbia, which is about retrofitting higher density into the existing urban matrix. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about Wallace Road as I come to the end of my time. This is our studio today, and from where I am speaking to you now. It was built as a factory, ironically, to make the first ever manufactured alternatives to tortoiseshell and ivory, so that actually it was a plastic that was intended to save species that were being plundered for human artifacts. And that material was called Parksine, and it was the place where Parksine was originally manufactured. Parks, the inventor and the owner of the factory, sadly went out of business after 2 years. And of course, the building has had very many different uses since then, but it's now our studio. Here are some of the key points about the building. We've kept the exposed brickwork, and we've used the benefits of its thermal mass. So actually the external walls do not have additional insulation, but the roof and the floor certainly do. Obviously, we have an all-electric system, we have air source heat pumps, and we have MVHR to provide us with heat in the winter. I'm pretty much out of time, so that was a real canter, wasn't it? Here's an image of us installed in our studio, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much indeed, Patty.
Well, thank you, Ben, for the presentation. I'm just obviously now joining the session for the Q&A. Just to remind listeners, you can leave your questions to Ben through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your webinar screen. So do take some time to consider what you might like to ask Ben or reflect on from his presentation, and do pop those in that chat function. So Ben, you mentioned in your presentation, just by way of starting a conversation with me, that obviously the practice in the early days had done a lot of renovation work and, kind of cut your teeth on those sorts of projects. And then that changed with more variations of new build, and you shared a few typologies you'd worked on. What do you feel in terms of like the trends of going back to renovation projects and retrofit in housing? Do you feel there's more demand coming through from clients and communities? What are you noticing?
Well, there should be, but I don't think there is enough.
Okay.
And the projects that I've showed were all possible because in those days there were very substantial amounts of money available through the government for estate refurbishments and regenerations in the day. So Sandringham buildings, for example, people used to be shocked by the thought that that was done in the 80s. It cost £130,000 per dwelling in order to achieve the renovation. And there was great criticism at the time of that cost. And Winterton House was part of a program called the Estates Action Program, which was funded by the DOE. In recent years, and in particular in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been no effective public grants for the kinds of radical refurbishments that I've illustrated here. There's been a kind of modest upgrade program under the Labour Party, the Decent Homes program, which is really about new heating systems and kitchens and so on. But the idea that you would invest heavily in an existing structure of the kinds that I've illustrated kind of disappeared a
Mm.
long time ago. And I think it does need to come back, and it needs to come back more. And we're very pleased to be doing the Sutton estate, which is,
Mm.
it involves uh, um, joining flats together to get closer to contemporary space standards, and pretty extensive reworking of the M&E systems and all of that. But it's few and far between, because the government has a view that the market will provide. The
Mm.
problem with that argument, of course, is that those spin-off benefits, human well-being, social value, and those sorts of things are not counted in
Mm.
to the cost-benefit analysis, and therefore, we need to argue for a wider appreciation of the benefits of renovation in order to see those kinds of things happening more.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben. And yeah, within the Retrofit 23 series, we've been covering topics like well-being and, the whole range of issues that go with the building fabric upgrades as well. So thank you, Ben. We do have some questions from our webinar audience, so I'll address those to you. So I suppose leading on from what you were saying, how do we get more money into housing, if you were sort of mentioning that as one of the barriers?
How do we get more money into housing? Vote Labour. Sorry.
No, yeah, you're welcome.
I mean, I mean, one of the themes of my book is that it's simply not acceptable and has not worked um, to rely on the market to provide for housing. Government subsidy and direct government action is unquestionably required, and I think a direct consequence of the reliance on market forces in order to meet our housing problem has resulted in, is a key reason for the current housing crisis. So, I mean, for what it's worth, lobby support any local politician who agrees with that proposition. I'm certainly, with others, advising the Labour Party on effective ways of achieving better outcomes in the world of housing.
Great, thank you. And then another question, how do you envision the book contributing to the ongoing discourse and action regarding residential retrofit? I suppose it's a continuation of what you were saying then, Ben. But...
Well, first of all, buy it.
And read it.
and then read it. Well, I mean, seriously, I fell out with the first publisher because I wanted a book that people would enjoy having. And so I've tried to make it a lovable object and something that's worth having on your shelves. But I really, more than 50 years doing what I've been doing is something that's difficult to convey quickly and easily. And so I really had a powerful yen to pass on to young practitioners. Actually, mostly the experience and those things which influenced us in the early years, particularly the chapter on lost utopias. The zeitgeist that contributes to the context for practice in the early years of this century, derives from a century in which we came to rely far too much on the motor car, in which we invented a planning system which encouraged urban sprawl and those sorts of things. And so I think to understand how we got here and what we need to do about it was a very considerable part of the motivation in writing it. And those that have bought it say that they found it stimulating and enjoyable. So it's available from our IBA bookshop and Amazon.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. And moving on to the next question. So I wonder, so this is from an anonymous attendee. I wonder what your thoughts are regarding inner London being a young person's domain. If you are a family or intending to be a family, high cost of living, buying is causing people to move out to the suburbs and out of the city. How can we influence this as architects and designers? So a little bit off tangent from the retrofit.
Well, no, I think it's an incredibly important social problem, and we're aware, that school rolls are dropping in some of the inner London boroughs. It matters a lot, and of course, one of the reasons it's happening is because of the market failure in housing, and the inability of young people to anything like afford their own homes. I mean, I do actually think it bears directly on the renovation issue, and I think there are solutions. When I bought my first house, it was at the precise moment that when the exodus of people living in London began to turn round to becoming, urban pioneers and so on in the early 1980s, beginning to repopulate the inner city. So I bought my house, which was a wreck, and I bought it with an amazing grant available from the then GLC, now GLA, which was non-returnable if you went on living in your house for more than 5 years, and it paid for half the cost of the restoration. Now, house prices were very low in those days, but one of the things, I note this in my book, as a young salaried architect, I was able to buy and renovate my house for less than the salary that I was then earning, i.e., less than 1-to-1 ratio of salary to housing cost. Now in London, we're talking about somewhere between 10-to-1 and 20-to-1.
Yeah,
And therein lies your problem.
10-to-1.
And I'm absolutely sure that although an increase in housing supply is important simply because there are a lot of homeless people, just increasing housing supply won't solve the problem. I'm completely clear that we need direct government intervention in the construction and renovation of housing in order to bring down the cost of housing if we want London to go on thriving as an energetic and creative place full of young people, who want to stay. That is a key requirement, and subsidy for renovation, I think, is going to be an incredibly important part of that. And by the way, obviously not renovation of what were just houses. I mean, I think the City of London is a really interesting proposition that crazily investors are still investing in gigantic steel and glass, so-called A-grade office space, and people are moving out of the rather lovely stone and brick built Edwardian buildings. Obviously, all of those should be housing, and what a great place the City of London would be if we began to turn some of those mid-rise streets that surround the dense skyscraper core into places where people lived and worked.
Well, great. Thank you, Ben. And thank you for the questions that are coming in. Question about the waste material. So what happens to this waste material that's pulled off the old buildings that you worked on if it can't be reused? And secondly, what is the most common challenge you've encountered in these retrofits and renovations over the years?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious first point to make is that it's by renovating a building, you are thereby minimizing waste. And redevelopment of building, of course, is maximizing waste. And quite a lot of these materials in 19th century buildings are eminently recyclable, bricks and timber in particular. That's not the biggest problem. I would say that renovation of more recent buildings does bring all sorts of complex problems, in particular bonded or laminated materials. Plasterboard with foil backing or plasterboard with foil and insulated backing is extremely difficult to separate and recycle effectively. I would say that one of the benefits of our work on modular systems is that just as you can build a building more sustainably by bringing it or already substantially built on the back of a lorry and hoisting it into place, you can unbolt it and take it all to bits. and then recycle it carefully in a factory. I'm saying this, that's clearly a claim. The factories that are disassembling the buildings that we've just been building do not yet exist. But we postulate that it's a more effective way of dealing with the recycling process than any other. Certainly, then more effective than making them out of concrete frames, where the enormous embodied carbon in the concrete just gets turned into rubble and buried.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben. We've got a few more minutes, so we'll just maybe take one or two final questions. So Ben, this question is about the practice, and in designing your projects, how do you consider embodied carbon?
We do an appraisal always. So as I've said, we have our own team of environmental engineers who do a kind of multifaceted appraisal of those aspects of sustainability that impinge on the decision about what to do. And it's not to say that we always renovate. We try to maximize the opportunities to renovate and infill around existing buildings. And embodied carbon is one of the, obviously in London, of course, it's a requirement to assess the embodied carbon in your buildings. I mean, I think the complexity here is that we need many, many more houses, many more homes than we have. So in the measurement of embodied carbon on, for example, an estate regeneration scheme, the measure that we find important is the amount of embodied carbon per person housed, rather than the absolute amount of embodied carbon. So if we're replacing a low-rise area of housing with a very high density area of housing, the hit on embodied carbon is not so great measured in those terms.
Right. Well, thank you, Ben. And I think we'll have to sort of finish with the questions for now. There's one or two more questions asking you more about the modular housing approach and things. So I'm sure if people...
That's for another time.
Yeah, another time. I'm sure if people look on HTA's socials, you've linked them on your finishing screen there, and people can probably find out more about your work and your projects. So thanks, Ben. Thanks for speaking today. And thank you, everyone, for attending this Retrofit talk. As I said, this is the penultimate webinar for the Retrofit 23 series. So next Tuesday lunchtime, we have Studio Partington talking about an energy sprung project in Nottingham. So do book and attend that next Tuesday lunchtime. And if you can attend the in-person events here at the Building Centre, we are continuing our Wednesday evening events until the 12th of October. So if you would like to come along tomorrow evening, we've got an event on the topic of upskilling. And then the Wednesday evenings that follow, we've got various other Retrofit Meets panel discussions with great lineup of speakers. So come and contribute, learn something, contribute something. We'd love to see you there. And all that information can be found on the Building Centre's website, so buildingcentre.co.uk. And the event's being recorded, and this one, which Ben has just presented, will be online shortly on our YouTube channel and on our events page of the website. So do look back. I can't remember how many events we've had so far, but about sort of 15 to 20 are already up and online. So there's a wealth of knowledge there for you to explore. And if you want to come into the Building Centre, we'd love to show you around the Retrofit 23 show. That's been extended till the 12th of October. So you've got a bit longer to come and visit and bring your colleagues and your friends along. And on the retrofit topic, we're continuing the theme for next year, and we're planning our Retrofit 24 programme, which will focus on commercial, cultural and civic projects. So do reach out to myself, Laura Broderick, or my colleagues, John Bonning, if you would like to find out more, think about ways you could partner and support and work with us on that. So thank you again to you, Ben. And yeah, thank you all for attending, and we hope to see everybody soon. Take care.
Thank you, Laura.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.